Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on Duke's Carolina IRPs, a misguided rush to gas. The presentation will last around 30 minutes and it will be followed by a Q&A session. If you have an urgent question, you can use the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen or type a question into the chat window. And this session is being recorded. So I'll introduce our two presenters, the authors of our series on Duke's IRPs, which are also available on our website. First is analyst editor Dennis Wamsted, who has covered energy and environmental policy and technology issues for 30 years. He's the former editor of the Energy Daily, a Washington, D.C. based newsletter. Also joining us is Seth Feaster. He's an energy data analyst for IEEFA. He has 25 years of experience creating visual presentations of complex data at the New York Times and more recently at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He specializes in working with financial and energy data. So without further ado, we can start the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Vivian. I'm Dennis Wamsted, and I was the lead author on this series of analyses that we did on Duke's pending IRPs in North and South Carolina. I'd like to welcome you all today. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us. We are very excited about the attendees here. We're very excited about this issue. This is a very important issue for the U.S. in general, not just for Duke and the folks in North Carolina. The transition that is underway will play out going forward here with an issue focused on natural gas. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to pull through with this analytical look into their IRPs and see where Duke's going and where they're not going. One thing Vivian didn't say in her introduction is if you have an emergency question, some factual issue that you missed or you think I've missed, please raise your hand and we can interrupt and deal with that as we go through the presentation. But if you have a question that can wait till the end, it'll probably be better if we hold those off and deal with them all as a batch. Jamie, could you put the next slide on, please? Just a little background. I'm not sure exactly of everybody's level of familiarity or expertise. Duke Energy is one of the largest utility companies in the United States. They say on their website that they currently have about 7.7 million customers that get their electric service and 1.6 million that get their gas service. They do business in 6 states and have a total of about 51,000 megawatts of generating capacity. Looked yesterday and they were the second largest electric utility company in the United States with a market capitalization of about $75 billion. Which is a little bit above the Southern Company and significantly lower than NextEra Energy in Florida, which has taken a very aggressive decision to embrace renewables and move forward. All that said, this is kind of sort of self-evident in that we believe that what Duke says and what Duke does matters a great deal, both for ratepayers in North and South Carolina, but for the country as a whole. The map, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, shows you the 2 operating utilities of Duke's in the North and South Carolina service territory. One is called Duke Energy Progress and the other is Duke Energy Carolinas. They were combined in 2012 through a merger, but they still operate separately and they still file independent integrated resource plans with regulators in the state. Jamie, next slide, please. These IRPs that we are discussing today were filed last August or September. And as many of you know, there's been a lengthy rulemaking procedure before state regulators with public hearings and testimony. We have not participated directly in those hearings and any of the filings. And so all of our research throughout the series that we did is based on publicly available information. And we probably could have done a little deeper dive if we had signed on to their non-disclosure agreements, but then of course we couldn't have had this webinar to share all of our findings with you. So there's a little two sides to that coin. Next slide, please. In the IRPs that were filed, proposes 6 different scenarios going forward. IRPs, just as a background, are designed to chart a utility's course over a 10 to 15-year period. Most investor-owned utilities throughout the country are required to file them on a varying or sliding scale. Some are every 2 years, some are 3. I think there's a couple that are 4 years. And they look out usually 10 or 15 years. The ones that are 15 years down the road are a little past perhaps where you might really want to be planning, because things change so quickly, and that is clearly the case with the electricity system in the United States over the past 4 or 5 years. We expect significant changes in the coming 4 or 5 years, which will help to undercut the proposals that Duke put forward in its IRPs last year. Slide here, for those of you who haven't seen it, has vertical charts or vertical columns that outline the 6 cases that they examined, and then the horizontal columns to the left talk about the various types of resources that would be added during the period from 2020 to 2035. 5 of the cases involve significant new natural gas generation capacity in their service territory. They proposed a 6th scenario that they called their no new gas generation. It's our opinion at IEEFA that they proposed it basically as a straw man, so they could say, look, we proposed it, but it's so expensive we couldn't possibly go forward with that. If you could go to the next slide, Jamie. The focus for our analysis and the focus for today's webinar are on the 3 columns that are outlined here in the bright yellow. The basic proposals or the base cases that are put forward by Duke in its IRPs are on the left. One that assumes that there is no accounting for carbon dioxide emissions going forward, and one would add essentially a tax of $5 a ton as a starter to generation resources in 2025 and continuing from there. And the third one that we focus on a great deal is the no new gas generation column. The folks at Duke have highlighted how expensive that column is and how much of a change it would require in the system in a very short period of time. We look at it from completely the opposite side of the spectrum, and we believe basically the shows that you can make the transition. You do not need gas, and now basically what we're talking about is how to do it quickly, and how to do it as cheaply as possible. So it's actually possible, and we believe now we should be focused on how to go about doing it. Jamie, next slide, please. Taking the IRPs and all the other speeches and financial presentations that Duke's presented in the past few years or past few months, we took all that and tried to do an in-depth analysis of all the information that we could get our hands on. And we have published a 4-part series on the IRPs, which basically come to the conclusion that the IRPs are a tool for tilting the decision-making process toward building new gas generation in the years to come. We'll get into these in more detail as we go through it. We believe that the IRPs significantly understate the contribution that wind, solar, and battery storage can make to the to Duke utility systems in the next 15 years. And we think that Duke's handling of their IRPs is in contradiction to its 2050 plans to reach net zero carbon emissions. They have proposed, as you'll see in a minute here, building new gas generation in the 2020s and 2030s, which in our view, from a financial perspective and an operating perspective, you can't square that with retiring that facility in 2050 to meet a net zero carbon emissions pledge. Jamie, next slide, please. One of the key factors in Duke's IRPs is an assessment or an assumption, one that not just Duke, but every utility basically assumes that there will be growth going forward. Utilities like to have growth because that allows them to go to their regulators and say, we need to install new generation capacity, and then put it in our rate base, and then recover the costs from ratepayers, and also make a profit on it. So it's nice to have growth. Utilities have always predicted growth. This chart is one that Seth pulled together for us based on the data that Duke has released. And there are two things that you really need to focus on here. One is our little black snake on the left side of the column that sort of oscillates up and down around 120,000, and that's 120,000 gigawatt hours. The numbers, we try to steer away from, too many numbers when we're talking about these kinds of things, but that has been the amount of retail power demand in Duke's service territory essentially since 2005. It has risen above 120,000 and it has gone below 120,000, as you can see. The last line there was actually the actual numbers for 2020. 2020 was a bad year with COVID and all the other issues, and demand fell to, I think it's 117,000 gigawatt hours. But basically, it's just a continuation of the past 15 years when demand has gone up, sometimes with colder weather or warmer weather, and demand has gone down. The other thing that you really need to pay attention to are the three colored lines toward the right of the chart, which show the predictions in the past three Duke IRPs for future growth in their service territory. All of them obviously are or have projected a significant amount of growth going forward. The growth hasn't happened, at least in the past. So we question seriously whether it will happen going forward. The same efficiency transitions that have occurred in the past 10 years are going to be in the service territory in Duke going forward. And so there is a great deal of uncertainty as to whether this growth will actually happen. If this growth does not happen, clearly, much of the underpinning for the new gas generation that Duke wants to build goes away. You can actually see another interesting thing in this chart, that Duke sort of knows that the growth isn't going to be what it wants it to be, because the starting point in 2016 and 2018 and 2020 has been essentially the same number. The growth was a little higher in 2016, and then they lowered it a little 18, a little in 2020, but they've moved out the starting point. So they're convinced it's going to start from there and grow into the future. But in any case, so pay attention to those numbers if you review this going forward. But this is also one of the key issues for people who are looking not just to Duke, but for other companies, IRPs around the country. Growth forecasts are the key. And you'll find when you look in these documents, usually that utilities are projecting growth. It may not be, super growth. It may not be 3% a year, but it could be 1.5, or it could be 1. But the important thing to know is that 1% a year over a 15-year period of time is actually a significant amount of new electricity demand, which you can then turn around and use to justify building a new generation facility, perhaps a gas-fired facility. Jamie, next slide, please. So this is a little more in the number geek world here. The focus in their endpoint in their last IRP in 2020 was that demand would climb to 135,000 gigawatt hours by 2035, a significant increase from the starting point, which they projected at 123 200 gigawatt hours, 123,200 gigawatt hours in 2021. But they're not going to be anywhere close to 123,000 gigawatt hours in 2021 because their starting point is 117. So just take that for what it is. The utility has a vested interest in projecting growth. Without growth, there is no need for new generation. The reality is that retail demand at most utilities around the country has been almost flat since 2010. There are different examples in different states where you'll see growth or you won't see growth. There are certainly examples up in New England where the entire region in New England has been able to lower demand significantly in the past 10 years because of a region-wide focus on energy efficiency issues. But this is one of the keys to contesting an IRP or understanding what the utility is trying to say and why it may not actually turn out the way the utility thinks it's going to turn out. Jamie, can we have the next slide, please? In addition to general demand, yearly demand, annual load, however you want to phrase it, the Duke forecasts also call for or expect a significant amount of what is called peak demand. So Duke is a winter peaking system now, and so its peak demand will probably be hit, in a cold January or February morning, and they, the companies plan for that. There are a lot of other utilities are summer peaking. We are actually turning. A number of utilities have turned from summer peaking into winter peaking over the past few years. But so in the IRPs that Duke put forward, and here, at least on this slide, I'm focusing on Duke Energy Carolina, which is the bigger of the two systems. It has more customers, and so it's just a little bit easier to get your hands around the numbers or get your brain wrapped around the numbers here. But so Duke Energy Carolina is predicting an increase of about 1,600 megawatts in peak demand on the system by 2035. And I can't say 100% for sure that demand won't occur, but the same is true for Duke. They can't say it will occur. What we do is look at what has happened in the past, and peak demand in Duke Carolina's service territory has been essentially flat since 2014. It too, we didn't do a chart to focus on this too, but it too has gone up or down. Obviously, you would expect with, if it's a cold winter, the peak demand on that first, bad day in February or January is going to be really high. And then on those winters, when the temperatures aren't that low, the peak demand is not going to be that high. So you need to look at those numbers, and you need to question those numbers significantly. If you're looking into what a utility is proposing, Duke has done the same thing with its summer numbers, with expectation of sharp growth or sustained growth through 2035. And interestingly, they don't make a big deal out of it, but they actually now they've changed their forecast in 6 years. So they had previously been forecasting that peak demand would climb to 20,291 megawatts, as you can see on this slide, in 2021. And they now don't expect to hit that peak demand in the summer until 2035. So that's a twofold issue for Duke here. It shows how significantly things have changed in the past 6 years, but it also seriously undercuts their argument that there's going to be significant increases in peak demand going forward. If it didn't happen before, why are you now telling us it's going to happen in the future? And there are obviously ways to address peak demand without building new gas-fired generation. Energy efficiency is a huge potential opportunity. in any service territory. And there are folks who say that Duke has been relatively progressive on energy efficiency. It's not an issue that we have covered carefully at IEEFA, so I will steer clear of that. But I do know that there are many opportunities out there that haven't been taken advantage of yet. Jamie, next slide, please. So Duke then builds on its demand forecast and its peak growth forecast, and uses that in its IRPs as justification for building in the system as a whole, building 3 new natural gas combined cycle generating facilities over the course of the IRP lifetime. So two would be proposed, or 2 are proposed in the Duke Energy Progress service territory, and 1 is proposed in the Duke Energy Carolina service territory. And here we get into those issues that we when you say, there isn't going to be this demand, so we don't think there's a need for the gas plants to start with. However, if you also at the far end of your planning horizon are saying you're going to become a net zero carbon company, which Duke has said many, many times and put a date certain to it of 2050, you then have to compare the 2 issues. So if you're planning on building a brand spanking new natural gas fired facility in 2028 or 2027, as in the Energy Progress facility or service territory, you are looking at having to retire that plant in 22 years or 23 years. Well, in its conventional planning, Duke says that it expects these plants to run for 35 years. So going forward, that would mean that those plants would have to retire 12 or 13 years before the end of their economic lifespan. That potentially puts a huge burden, financial burden, on ratepayers. The company, in standard regulatory rate-making procedures, the company goes to the regulators and they approve a plant and say, okay, this plant is needed. You can recover the costs from your ratepayers. If that were to happen in this process, they would be retiring a plant 12 or 13 years before they had recovered all the costs. But since they had gotten approval for it, they would probably be able to continue to recover those costs, even though the plants were shut down. It's an enormous financial risk for ratepayers, and it's one we think that the company is glossing over, and we think the regulators need to pay a significantly put significantly more attention on this issue going forward. The Duke argument about these gas plants has evolved a little bit over the past few months, and they have now said that they also looked at a 25-year expected lifespan for these gas plants, and that giving them potentially a little less of a stranded asset potential down the road. But they would still have to pay for the whole thing. And even if they retired in 2025, and even if they said it was economic, the ratepayers would be on the hook for paying for the plant, regardless of when the utility actually retired the facility. Jamie, next slide, please. So one of our key findings throughout the report, and I've said it a couple of times here, is without future demand growth, there is no need for these large combined cycle gas generation facilities. And it's also interesting that these proposals were put forward obviously before the change in administration in November, but it's also before there was a change in administration, if you will, at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is taking a very, very involved and aggressive look at pipeline siting capacity. And this is important. It's a little bit on the wonky side, but it's important because in the past, pipelines essentially were sited when the pipeline builder said there's a need for this. And now FERC is considering changing that rule so that there would be a much greater look at the greenhouse gas impacts of future projects. And we bring this up because in its IRPs, Duke admits that it doesn't actually have the gas fuel supplies that it needs to run these facilities. And as you can see on the slide here, it states that we assume that we will be able to procure the firm transportation service for our gas that we need to run these gas facilities. And I would venture to say to you that that is not an assumption that I would make. And I would certainly not think that they want to bet a significant amount of shareholder dollars on those. Whether they want to bet the ratepayer dollars on that, that's a issue we can discuss here. And the third thing, or third issue on the gas supply issue, it is obviously the administration's stated intention to pay much more attention to environmental justice issues. Siting pipelines has been incredibly difficult over the past 5 years, and it's going to get more difficult as we go forward, especially if we have a serious commitment to these environmental justice concerns and siting pipelines through places that traditionally have been sought after by pipeline companies because maybe they weren't complaining quite as much or didn't have the resources to complain. Jamie, next slide, please. So now we transition a little bit here. One of the other shortcomings that we see throughout Duke's IRPs, it basically ignores the potential of battery storage in the electric utility industry. The company has been chastised by regulators in the past during previous IRPs before the 2020-21 for not addressing battery storage. This IRP or these two IRPs don't do a much better job. They do have some placeholders for battery storage in there, but it's clear, for over the past 4 or 5 months of developments in the utility industry, that Duke is completely a laggard in the adoption of battery storage potential, battery storage uses. We have done a great deal of analysis on this in our power outlook that came out about 2 weeks ago. And utilities across the country, little ones, big ones, municipals and co-ops and big investor-owned utilities are all embracing battery storage for different reasons. You can do an awful lot of things with these batteries. You can use them to firm up renewable energy, which is pretty conventional. You can use them to supply capacity on that cold winter morning in January or February, which would help supply some of that peak demand that Duke thinks it's going to need. You can use it to lessen your reliance on the transmission system, which is not necessarily an issue for Duke, but certainly is elsewhere in the country. We think this chart here does a good job of just sort of comparing where Duke is versus its competitors or its colleagues in the utility industry. The blue totals show that Duke is basically saying it's going to build about 200 megawatts of battery storage through 2025. Down in Florida, Florida Power and Light, which is owned by the NextEra Energy Company, is building a 400 megawatt facility this year alone, and is going to be using that facility in conjunction with a big solar plant to retire an old, very large gas plant in their service territory. There are companies out there around the US in the utility sphere who have and are embracing battery storage. Duke is not one of them. Next slide, please, Jamie. This is another way of looking at the same lack of commitment by Duke. This estimate here was pulled together by the folks at Wood Mackenzie, which is a good research analytical firm. And two things are noteworthy here. 2020 was the first year that we installed more than 1,000 megawatts of battery storage in the entire United States. 4 or 5 years ago, battery storage was very much a niche product. That is not true anymore. Their forecast going forward is that by 2025, we will be installing almost 8,000 megawatts of battery storage in the US per year. That would take, and this chart is segregated in the deep blue and the lighter blue. The deep blue is the utility sector. That deep blue over the next 5 years adds up to essentially 20,000 megawatts across the United States. It's an enormous sum that's going to have a very significant impact on the utility sector in states everywhere. It's going to allow, new solar to come online in Texas, be stored during the day and used in the evening. It's going to allow solar in California, instead of being wasted, essentially thrown away, to be collected during the day and used in the evening. It's going to allow other facilities to use storage to bid into markets where it's never been possible before. But the takeaway is just the enormous ramp up that's underway, and the lack of interest or conviction or concern by Duke Energy. Next slide, please, Jamie. So same slide. The key here is the little note at the top. We don't do what's called generation expansion modeling at IEEFA, or capacity expansion modeling. It's a very specialized world in the electric utility industry. But utilities use these models, which are very complex and take a significant amount of computer power to run. They use these models to forecast their generation needs in the years to come, 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. And there are smart people on the intervener side who use these models or study these models and figure out, well, you might have made this mistake here and you might have made this mistake there. Well, one of the big mistakes that Duke made was that its 2020 model for capacity expansion could not account for battery storage. So they had to use a proxy when they were doing their analysis, which was a number derived from pumped hydro storage, which is not the same thing as battery storage by any stretch, but it indicates the sort of out of touch nature of the pending IRPs. Part of this may not be Duke's fault, because the models themselves are complicated and hard to revive or revise. I understand that Duke is actually moving to a model that will account for battery storage. But the fact that they proposed an IRP without being able to account for this changing aspect of the electric utility sector in our minds is a huge error. Jamie, next slide, please. One of the other shortcomings that we saw in Duke's analysis was a big issue with its sort of, well, yeah, we like renewables, but we're not going to really build them now. And this is completely evident in their approach to offshore wind. There is a project essentially ready to go off the North Carolina coast, proposed by a company called Avangrid, which is a subsidiary of a Spanish utility called Iberdrola. And they have proposal out offshore of North Carolina for about 2,500 megawatts of wind to be built in 3 segments, 800, essentially 800 and 800. And they have submitted an application to the Department of Interior, and they have submitted a bunch of economic analysis showing what kind of commercial impact this could have if and when it's built. Their last analysis showed a benefit, but it was mostly a benefit for those towns up in Virginia, Norfolk and Virginia Beach, because Virginia is moving ahead aggressively on offshore wind and North Carolina is not, and certainly Duke is not moving anywhere on offshore wind. The base cases that I referred to at the beginning of my presentation showed that Duke didn't expect offshore wind to enter its service territory until after 2035. Clearly, with the Biden administration's recent pledge to install 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, we think that approach of Duke's is a little out of date. The same thing can be true or said for their solar build out. They are planning to build solar capacity in the country or in their service territories, but they're not nearly at the same rate or speed as comparable utilities around the country, such as Florida Power and Light and American Electric Power. Jamie, next slide, please. So since I've seen 1,000 questions speed by at the bottom of my screen here as I've been giving this presentation, I do want to wrap up. We have some recommendations that we think regulators and ratepayers should be thinking about in North and South Carolina. We think that Duke should be required as part of this process to submit some revised forecasts. They have submitted a growth forecast. We think they ought to submit a growth forecast that includes less growth or actually even no growth. How does that change the plan going forward? We also think that Duke should be required to seek what are called competitive all-source bids for battery storage and wind and solar. When this has been done in other utilities in the country, the bids from the industry, if you will, have been significantly lower than estimates provided by the utilities themselves. You can see this in competitive bidding in Colorado, Indiana, and in many other states in the U.S. And I know that Duke is moving to this generation expansion module. They should be required to run some of their current IRP work with a model that can handle the use of battery storage in a real-time mode as opposed to a proxy. And we think that if Duke does want to build these natural gas generation facilities that we believe would be stranded by 2050, we think that the utility and the shareholders of the utility should be required to assume that risk rather than pushing that risk off onto ratepayers. And I think that will take us to the end. Jamie, let's put on that last slide that has the links to everything. So here we have the 4-part series of analyses that we did on the IRPs that are linked here, and you can find on our website if you haven't looked at them. They're not long, I promise. Shouldn't take you too long to read them, and might spark some more questions. But with that, I will come to a close, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Hey, Dennis, can you see the questions in the chat, or would you like me to ask them?
I will open up the chat, but it'd be easier if you read them to me.
Okay, I'll do that. So I'm going to do them in chronological order, the order in which they arrived. Several participants raised, more than one question, but I will take them as they came. So the first one is from Ben Kessler. He asks, what makes SMR the most economic in no new gas generation over the 0 megawatt capacity of others? I think this is referring to slide 5, the scenario slide.
Yeah. Well, Ben, what I would tell you is that their cost estimate for SMRs is just that. It's an estimate. They also go on in their IRPs to say they do not believe that there will be sufficiently commercial options available. IRPs are done. So they raised it as a potential option, and then they shot it down. Just in general, for those who don't follow this issue, SMRs are small modular reactors. They can range. There's no real definition. They range from 50 to 300 megawatts in size. They are touted by their proponents as potentially being cheaper than conventional nuclear power plants, which are much larger, because they can be manufactured at a facility, trucked to the site, and basically plugged in and run. That is, in our view, a highly questionable series of assumptions. And the one SMR company that is furthest along, NuScale, has been hoping to have something built by 2025, and that deadline has now been pushed, or that commercial date has now been pushed out to 2028 or 2029. Construction has not started on any SMRs in the US. We are not optimistic about their potential because they're chasing an ever lowering cost factor in wind, solar, and battery storage. So the today cost estimate for SMRs could be 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and it won't go down by 2030 in our view. but the cost of solar and wind and battery storage is going down, and it's already lower than that 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So we think there's kind of a disconnect there. But Duke put it in there and then proceeded essentially to say that they wouldn't be using SMRs.
Okay. So next question is from Nancy La Placa. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Can you address the importance of discount rates in the IRP? I asked Duke Energy what discount rate they used, and they said they couldn't tell me, but it was in Duke's 10K filings at around 5.3%. Can you talk about how this affects the total cost, PVRR, for fossil fuel heavy scenarios?
Well, the lower the better. We haven't Nancy, we haven't done that analysis, but the company has a discount rate or an average weighted cost of capital, and the lower it is, the better, and the lower the cost. So it would lower the cost for ratepayers too. But we really haven't looked into that, so I would be hesitant to go off on an answer trying to come up with a real estimate for that. That might be something that we could handle in an email or an exchange after the webinar.
Okay, next question is from Maple Osterbrink. She points out that Duke netted $1.1 billion last year and says it's unacceptable and it should be illegal. And she's wondering how to challenge the legality of some of this behavior.
Well, the way
Also,
to challenge
the coal ash toxins question as well.
Right. Well, the way to handle this is by getting involved with the regulatory process. It's not exciting, but there are a number of very, very involved groups in North Carolina. NC Warren, Vote Solar, SELC, the Sierra Club is involved, and you don't have to personally be involved, but you can be involved through them, certainly. It is the regulators who set the rules and allow Duke to recover or not recover certain costs. And the more pressure regulators get from the outside, the more likely they are to change their thinking from past years, perhaps, to more equitably share the costs between ratepayers and shareholders. Obviously, you can be involved at the legislative level as well. North Carolina seems to be changing a little bit a la the transition in Virginia over the past 10 years. And there is a more aggressive approach now in North Carolina toward dealing with climate change issues. But that's being done at the government level, at the legislative level. And that's another option for involvement. The coal ash settlement, in our minds, is, well, it's settled, so I'm not sure there's anything that can be done about it. But in our minds, this is a clear indication of why we should be done with coal everywhere right now, because this is just one more cost that gets added onto what ratepayers have to pay across the country, not just in North and South Carolina, for the costs or for the privilege, if you will, of burning coal. And so it won't end up in the actual power cost. It'll be put on as an adder probably to ratepayer bills, and it ends up, getting paid for. But it's a clear indication of the real costs of coal, and the real costs of coal are much, much higher than just the power production costs of coal. Duke didn't get everything it wanted in the coal ash settlement, so that might be a good sign. I'm not sure exactly how that all played out. We're not coal ash experts, so I will steer a little bit clear of that. So
Okay.
where are we going now? Okay.
So Michael Totten had, this is the first of several questions from him. He says, does Duke justify growth by shift from combustion to electrification, combined with leaving most efficiency gains untapped?
Most of Duke's analysis tends to focus just on the growth in customers in its service territory. and essentially assumes we are going to have, North Carolina has been a pretty high growth area for new customers or new residents, and Duke has grown significantly in the past 10 years. And one of the things we point out in our analysis is that even though the number of customers has grown, the electricity demand has not grown. So you can't just say, okay, well, we expect there to be 1 million more customers in our service territory in the next 10 to 15 years. Therefore, demand will increase. Those two may happen, but what has happened in the past has not followed that trend or that trend. And so we think that much of what they are predicting is based on just sheer numbers or sheer increase in number of customers. They also are not, in my view, they're not overly aggressive on energy efficiency potential in their service territory. They do have some programs, and they do have had success with some programs, but we think there is more to be gained from a more aggressive approach to energy efficiency.
Okay, next question is from Ron Lair. He asks, what discount rate does Duke apply to future costs to bring them back to present value? Has anybody tried alternative discount rates, say twice WACC or half WACC, to see what that reveals? Duke has both 85 and 3-year-old customers. Do high discount rates like WACC favor 85-year-olds?
This probably, unfortunately, Ron, I would say is a conversation better had outside the parameters of this webinar. Obviously, you're onto a good point. Issues, if you're paying for something in 2050, that's not so good for an 85-year-old. Or no, that is good for an 85-year-old. It's not. Regulatory or rate-making proceedings haven't tended to focus on generational equity. Duke is not by any stretch the only utility that has these issues ongoing at the moment. The folks at Southern who are building Vogtle units 3 and 4 have a multi-billion-dollar disaster on their hands, and people will be paying for that reactor. A baby born today will be paying for that reactor for his or her entire life. And obviously, so they're stuck regardless. The 85-year-old is paying now for it and will pay for the rest of his or her life. But that's not been a factor in rate-making procedures in the past. I don't think it would be in the future either.
Okay, another one from Michael Totten. He asks, are efficiency gains fully considered in the IRP? Are the perverse incentives for supply expansion and constraints on demand side savings options still in place?
I do not believe efficiency gains are fully considered in the IRP. But I have to go back to where we started. We do not have access to Duke's modeling runs or Duke's assumptions. We have access to Duke's output. And they have written about efficiency issues and about their efficiency programs in their IRP proposals. From the studying I've done and the folks we know that follow these issues closely, we don't think that they have stretched, shall we say, in embracing energy efficiency going forward. There isn't usually a utility incentive to stretch for efficiency gains when you're paid on kilowatt hours, when you're paid for steel that gets put into the ground. Efficiency tends to get put by the wayside, and if it's required by regulators, it will be met to the requirement, but probably not above that.
Okay, Bill Cap asks, does IEEFA have an estimate of the growth from electric vehicle use?
We didn't do our own estimate of electric vehicle use. The growth presented by Duke was not significant. And we haven't seen enough work on the reality of the system right now is that for the initial huge chunk of new EVs that come into the market, when you design the charging incentives correctly, all they will end up doing is take they'll take electricity from the grid in the overnight periods when existing generation is not being used. So they won't, in our view, lead to the early need for new generating capacity. You have to design the system so people are given incentives to charge at the right time. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's almost always, in almost every utility system around the country, plenty of excess capacity. So overall, electricity demand might go up, but the need for new generation wouldn't go up, at least initially, and certainly not with the forecasts for new EV adoption in the Duke IRPs that we saw.
Next one is from Ron Lair. What does Duke forecast with regard to gas fuel prices? If their forecast is wrong and too high, consumers get hedge benefits of more efficiency and renewables. If wrong and too low, consumers pay higher than expected costs. Fuel risks for consumers are asymmetric. Better to be wrong and too high than wrong and too low. Only certainty, fuel cost projections will be wrong.
100% fuel projections costs or fuel cost projections will be wrong. Gas prices in Duke, as I understand it, are a pass-through cost. And so Duke doesn't make any money on it one way or the other. It is fully a charge borne by ratepayers. Duke doesn't look at gas price forecasts when they do their IRPs, I don't believe, as to whether that justifies the building of a new combined cycle plant or not. I'm not sure that those two issues are linked in their IRP, but once again, I have to say, we did not see their modeling, and I do not remember seeing anything in there about their using gas price forecasts either to justify building new gas generation or to argue against it.
Okay, and the next one is from Michael Totten. Does the Duke IRP indicate the percentage reduction in demand that can be achieved? And run scenarios based on capturing all efficiency gains that are lower in cost up to the point of expanding any new supply. Is Duke allowed a fuel adjustment clause, and do they project different nature gas fuel costs in future years?
Michael, your question is sort of the same as Ron's, as I get it about fuel costs. So I will save my answer from that one for before. Yes, they do have a fuel adjustment clause, as I understand it. On the modeling run, again, unfortunately, I don't know. We did not see their modeling scenarios, so I don't know. Unfortunately, I apologize for that. We were intentionally taking sort of the layperson's view of their analysis and trying to get at arguments for, or in our case, against their proposals based on what normal people could see from the outside, or relatively normal people, if I consider myself normal, as opposed to getting into the weeds of their modeling specifications. So I apologize for that, but the intent of our analysis was a little more 15,000 foot level as opposed to deep down in the weeds. But I'd be happy to try to follow up with you on that.
Okay, next one is from Maple Osterbrink again. It sounds more like a comment than an actual question, though. She says that we should be moving to zero emissions, not net zero, and that offsets are a non-reduction.
We're pretty
in carbon, I guess.
We have questions about offsets as well, Maple, that's for sure. Our approach, or at least my approach, and I think Seth shares this opinion with me, is that we need to move as fast as we can by 2030 to reduce as many emissions as we possibly can. We're not big fans of, nor do we certainly endorse, oh, you get out of jail free card if you say you're going to be net zero by 2050. It really doesn't matter what you do in 2050 if between now and 2050, you've run your gas and your coal plants at full bore, and then all of a sudden in 2045, you build carbon capture facilities at those units. We definitely need to worry about the easier, large section of emissions that we can reduce in the near future. We can argue with the exact number, but there's probably an easy argument to make that we could get 80% reduction in emissions in the next 10 to 12 years. And that's what we need to focus on, not the 100% emissions by some date way down the road. So I agree with you in concept here. We may phrase it a little bit differently, I think, but.
Okay, next question is also from Michael Totten. He says Duke has a severely constrained incentive program for residential and commercial solar PV rooftop systems, presumably arguing they are more expensive than central supply systems. Can you comment on how to counter this argument as to total life cycle, least cost, and risk leveled costs?
Well, the answer to the first part of your comment is that definitely utilities around the country will definitely argue that rooftop solar and rooftop solar with storage is vastly more expensive than central stations. And that's an argument from 10 or 15 years ago. The counter argument is that rooftop solar, especially rooftop solar with a battery hooked up to it, is a significant increase in resilience to the whole system. And we need to move toward a scenario here where we're, we've had problems both in California this year, and certainly the problems I imagine you guys are familiar with in Texas, but also up and down the plain states in that very cold snap we had in February. We need a little more resilience in the system, perhaps a lot more resilience in the system. And the performance of the central station generation facilities during that freeze was horrible, in a word. There were gas plants that went offline. There were coal plants that went offline. There was some problems with the wind turbines, not nearly as much as you might hear in certain sources. And it's also very important to realize that wind isn't counted on if it's a 1,000 megawatt wind turbine or wind farm, excuse me. It's not counted on for 1,000 megawatts of wind. It might be counted on for 400 megawatts of wind. So you have to be careful when you or anyone else are reading about the failure of wind during that cold snap or elsewhere. The projections aren't about the capacity, it's about the actual generation. But we think there is a move toward greater resilience, or building in greater resilience in the grid. And battery storage is clearly going to help with that. Having rooftop solar is going to help with that. Maybe down the road we turn into microgrids. I'm not sure of the economics of that, but some of the economics have to be, you can't just compare once again, back to what I said a little bit earlier, it's not just the price of the power. Obviously, a microgrid has cost benefits to it that have to be able to be factored in. If you don't lose power, that's a benefit. If you're not reliant on just one central station unit, that's a benefit.
Okay, and I just want to make a comment here that it's 2 o'clock. So I think we can stay on the line if other folks want to stay on the line and ask more questions. We certainly have a queue of questions here. So we'll continue, but anybody who has to log off, if you do have more questions, you can always email them to us, and you can see the email addresses on your screen. So here's another question from Michael Totten. He asks, would a high shadow price for social cost of carbon adopted by the PUC help dampen the gas build out? He lives in Asheville and he wonders if the city could municipalize their distribution system.
Well, the answer to the first question, in my view, is it certainly would help dampen the move toward building out any new fossil generation. Um, there, obviously it's a shadow price. So you would be saying, we think this is going to happen at some point in the future. But obviously, if you add cost to any system and don't change the cost of the other systems, the relative economics, shift. We would argue that solar and well, solar certainly in Duke's service territory is already competitive with gas. And I think you could argue in 2 or 3 years, solar with storage is competitive with gas. If you add to the cost of gas, that just shortens the time frame for when solar and storage are competitive in and of themselves. The answer to your second question is, I'm sure you could municipalize. It's been tried a number of other places. It's been abandoned in several places. I don't know the specifics of it, but there are serious costs involved. It's not something I would go into without having my eyes wide open. You may not like Duke or may not think they provide good service, but replacing it is a costly endeavor and would take a great deal of planning and involvement by everybody in the city. So I'm not saying you certainly could do it, but make sure that everybody's aware of the issues involved.
Okay. We have a question from Sid Abma, and I think he's recommending that we move to coal since coal has more BTUs than natural gas and oil combined.
Well, Sid, we'll let you have that opinion, but we at IEEFA think that it's past time for us to move away from coal. We think that closing every coal plant in the United States is a doable option in the very near future. We do not believe that there is such a thing as clean coal. You can clean coal up at great expense. You can clean coal up and you still have great big problems with coal ash, as we discussed earlier in this presentation. So we have options now. We have cleaner options and we have cheaper options, and we believe that we need to move toward those, saying nothing about climate change.
Okay. Here's another question from Michael Totten. Does Duke consider the value of
We gotta
risk?
hire this guy. Vivian.
I know, Michael, I mean, come on. I'm just, as I say, I'm going in chronological order here. So does Duke consider the value of risk reduction resulting from on-site, behind the meter, and distributed energy services, efficiency, solar, PV, ground source, geothermal systems, compared to large-scale supply expansion? A value of solar, value of efficiency tariff, question mark.
Oh, Michael, I will confess I don't know the answer with 100% certainty, but my gut reaction would be that no, they do not consider the value of risk reduction. I don't know how you would value it. I know people put a value on it. I do not believe that Duke has done that, and given the shortcomings of their model on battery storage, I'm not sure that they would have had a value of risk reduction from that kind of on-site facility. But I will acknowledge that I don't know that for sure.
Dennis, Seth here. Could I add something about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So I think that one of the things we see from looking at their IRPs without the benefit of knowing exactly what's in their model is what the results show, compared to some of the things we've seen elsewhere in the country. So for example, in the Power Outlook, there's great discussion about Green Mountain Power and the benefits that they have gotten from battery storage, residential battery storage. This is not a utility scale battery storage system. It's usually linked with solar. And it was a relatively small number of batteries, I believe 2,000 or fewer. And they were able to save at different times several $1 million because of various charges from the grid. And those kinds of, I think that the utility was a little bit surprised. They knew they might be there, but they were a little surprised at how much and how quickly they got those savings. And I point this out because in Duke's IRPs, they really discount both battery storage and solar and wind, all of which could combine to provide resilience and benefits like the ones that you're talking about there of risk aversion. And the fact that they're not really considering any of these things, let alone considering them together and how they might benefit from that, I think speaks volumes about their approach.
Okay. Again, from Maple Osterbrink, she has heard that wind south of DC and Virginia is not strong enough to invest in as a substantial energy source.
Well, Maple, here it's important to realize that wind onshore is not. You are correct. There just isn't the steady breeze that's necessary to make it economic. Offshore wind is a different animal entirely, and the proposal off the coast of economic proposal, and the studies have shown offshore wind on the East Coast is actually a wonderful option, partly because it's generation sited away from where people live in general, which is increasingly hard to site generation anywhere in the East Coast. And the wind up and down the coast tends to blow the strongest in the afternoon and the evening, which is when demand is the highest. So it makes for a good pairing where you have offshore wind that's contributing to the grid when the grid most needs that power. Onshore wind, I would agree with you. Offshore wind, I would not agree with you about south of DC and Virginia.
Okay, from Jason Sorter. He wonders if you could comment on the Texas Berkshire Hathaway Emergency Power Reserves proposal as compared to North Carolina Duke, and specifically its impacts on ratepayers.
Well,
why, as mentioned through your presentation, why this is over battery storage?
We think that Mr. Buffett proposed this in Texas because he thought he could make some money out of the deal. I've been quoted in a number of articles about the proposal. We don't think it really is worthwhile for Texas. Not sure that it's going to go through in any case. I don't think we've heard the last of it or heard a decision on it. But the company was proposing to build, I think it was 10 emergency natural gas generation facilities, and to get paid a flat amount for the next 30 years for that service. And in theory, that service would be available when it was needed in Texas. There wasn't a lot of meat on the bones of the proposal, so it wasn't certain how they were going to ensure that they got the needed gas supplies and who was going to pay for that. A large part of the problem in Texas this past February was the inability of facilities, gas generation facilities, to get gas supply. So you can't just build yet another gas generation facility and assume that there's going to be gas supply for it. Essentially, what he called it an emergency reserve, but essentially what this is a capacity market where you would be paying somebody to be available when they were needed. In this case, when it was really cold out. Texas has prided itself for years on being the state that doesn't have a capacity market. Whether that's the right way to go or not is a subject of a whole different set of webinars and analyses. But it was made by a businessman to try to make some return on investment. We don't think it's a great idea. We think there do need to be changes in Texas, but I don't think it's actually related to what's going on in North Carolina and Duke, because Duke is a vertically integrated utility which both generates and distributes its power versus the system that is in Texas.
Okay, this is from Kathy Buckley. She asks if the NCUC allows new gas plants with the provision of the that the shareholders pay for stranded assets? Is there not a risk that Duke could declare bankruptcy and still leave ratepayers, taxpayers with the bill?
There's always that risk. But if I was living in North Carolina, I would rather have the ratepayer or the shareholders get the share of that risk. If they declare bankruptcy, the ratepayers, I don't believe, would be on the hook. The bondholders would be on the hook, the people who finance the construction. It wouldn't be, it shouldn't be the ratepayers. If the system were to be designed that way, you could write it around so that they couldn't declare bankruptcy to get out of having to pay for it, or they couldn't declare it and pass it along to the ratepayers. But that, that's actually a concept that I had never thought of before. That utilities do declare bankruptcy every once in a while, and I hadn't considered that as an option in 2050. Now you got me thinking about all sorts of other things. Anyway, but I would love for shareholders to have to pay or share a little more of the risk. I think that would be a definite move in the right direction.
Okay, I think this is going to be the last question. It's from James Auchenfuss. He says, because of fixed rate of return and what goes into rate base, lower interest rates increase revenue requirements. The mechanism is lower interest costs, increases income, increases taxes, which increases rate recovery, assuming return on rate base is set by the commission.
And we appreciate that clarification. Sorry about that. It's hard to think on your feet sometimes when you've been talking for too long.
So if that's clear, Seth, do you want to say something before we wrap up?
No, thank you everyone for listening to the presentation. Thank you, Dennis.
And thank you all for joining us. It was a pleasure. With any luck, we will be able to keep in touch. And if you have any follow-up questions, my email is obviously on the back, and IEEFA is easily reachable. You can give us a call, send me an email, and we'll see if we can pin things down for you. But we appreciate you taking the time this afternoon.